Philip Augustus. Well, yeah, I want to repeat once again, the final will consist half of it on chapters 12 and 13, the other half will be comprehensive. He engaged in a program of conquest, and he conquered a lot of the French duchies. Now, I mean, you might say, wasn't he king of France? Yes, but he didn't, when he started out, he didn't have a lot of the duchies under his control, the counties. He conquered Normandy, the Duchy of Normandy, Maine, Anjou, and Aquitaine. After all, his father's first wife had been Duchess of Aquitaine. Well, he conquered Aquitaine. And also, long about his time, somehow, and I'm not sure how, but money began to circulate more in Europe. And I really can't say how the money came from. I know where it came from later. Later on, the Spanish got a lot of this gold from Mexico and Peru, but that was later. But money began to circulate in Europe, and Philip began to collect taxes in money. Now, before this time, king had collected revenue by, you have to furnish me troops. So each duke in each count would furnish the king troops, soldiers, knights, or whatever. Well, Philip Augustus began to collect revenue in money. He also got power the same way our government is getting power. He increased the power of the courts. Henry II had done this in England, and Philip Augustus did it in France, and our own government is doing it in our country. I believe I talked about that last time. Later kings after Philip would use war or money to purchase land or marriage alliances to try to increase their power. Philip Augustus did participate in the Third Crusade along with Richard the Lionhearted and Frederick, but Philip turned back without engaging the enemy and got Richard extremely upset at him. The next one was Philip the Bow. Philip IV, sometimes called the Fair. He was the one who set up the Estates General, again to raise revenue. Now, I want to say this about the Estates General. Unlike the Congress of the United States, unlike Parliament in England, the Estates General never did really become very powerful. In fact, Philip the Fair started it, and it met for a while. Then, during the reigns of Louis XIV and Louis XV, those two kings reigned for 130 years. Each of them, well, Louis XIV got the throne as a boy of 4, and Louis XV as a boy of 5. They were great-grandfather and great-grandson. But anyway, during their reigns, the Estates General never met. Then when Louis XVI wanted to raise revenue, he called in the Estates General, and the Estates General wound up chopping his head off. But anyway, other than that, it never became very powerful. Kings of France eventually learned to rule without them. But France, under Philip the Fair, became the best-run kingdom of Europe, and I can tell you where Philip got a lot of his money, folks. I'll talk more about this when I come to Crusades. Philip stole all the money he could get from the Knights Templars, the Templars. I say stole, he executed the Templars and took their wealth. Except some people believe the Templars took their treasury to America somewhere, and it's still here unfound. That's a whole different topic. But anyway, he got a lot of money. The Templars has set up a banking system, and they got rich through banking and by other means. Yes?
How do you spell Templars?
Templars, T-E-M-P-L-A-R-S, and yes, I am going to be talking about them more later when we come to Crusades. All right, moving on from France now. Holy Roman Empire. At first, the Holy Roman Empire was simply called the Roman Empire. But then, one of its kings called it the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had its domains in Germany and Italy. In other words, they tried to unite Germany and Italy into one big empire. the result was it failed. Germany and Italy were not to unite until 1870. The Holy Roman Empire lasted, such as it was, 1,000 years, and historians say it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. The Holy Roman Emperor was elected by a group of people called the electors, and the electors were determined it would never become hereditary, so they never elected the son of the former Holy Roman Emperor. So when the Holy Roman Emperor was elected for life by the electors, and when he died, the electors would meet, like our electoral college, they would meet, and they would always pick someone else besides the son of the former Holy Roman Emperor. So they picked someone, usually one of their own numbers, someone who was the most successful, or likely the strongest, likely to be the strongest, and he would rule for life. And this went on in Europe for hundreds of years. The first one of any of the amount to anything was Otto. A little aside here, Otto was fascinated by Charlemagne, and one day he went to Charlemagne's tomb and opened it up, and Charlemagne's body was in a remarkably good state of preservation despite having been dead for more than 100 years. But the fingernails are gone. Somebody may not know that after a person deceased, oftentimes their hair grows out, their fingernails grow out. But his beard had grown, his fingernails had grown, his hair had grown, but otherwise he was in a remarkably good state of preservation. But he opened the tomb of Charlemagne for probably the last time. Otto he was the beginning of this union to try to get Germany and Italy into one union. These attempts failed. I mean, the Germans and the Italians are different. The last attempt to get them together was during World War II. And Germany, Hitler found Mussolini to be a very weak and ineffective ally. And in fact, during World War I, the Italians were so weak that it was said that they actually helped the enemy more than they helped the side they were on. And some people said they were glad to see Italy join Germany in World War II because that helped guarantee that Germany would be defeated with having Italy on their side. Italy was like having a bad ball player on your side who consistently makes out, sort of misses the ball. That's it to him. Just a really bad player on the team. But they're different. The Germans are industrious and hardworking. The Italians, much less so. The union was not a good union, to say the least. All right, so much for Otto. He claimed he was reviving the old Roman Empire. Actually, it failed. Now, Henry IV is the next one. Here's where we come to a really, no, these are French. A really important event in the history of Europe that helped make Europe what it is. All right, folks, this was all part of the long battle between church and state that was last hundreds of years. The church felt like it should be on top. The state felt like it should be on top. And they went round and round with the church sometimes dominating the state, I say bad and wrong, and the state sometimes dominating the church, and again I say bad and wrong. Now what finally happened was church and state became two separate entities that were independent of each other. And yeah, great and good. Church and state, but though in their course of struggling for power, again, at times the one was on top and at times the other. But what happened in Europe that did not happen elsewhere in the world? Church and state eventually became separate entities. In Russia, church and state became one. The result was Russia went downhill. In the Muslim world, church and state became one. With the result, the Muslim world became stagnant. In Europe, eventually they reached a drawn battle. Church remained a church and state remained a state. Very important, folk. When the last pope before this one resigned, no king, no Congress, no United Nations picked the next pope. The succeeding pope was picked by the church. Now, this is where we get to Henry IV. The issue he faced was, Henry IV told the Pope, I think I should appoint all church officials in my land. Now again, hindsight has 20/20. I have to tell Henry, no, Henry, the church should appoint its own officials. Sorry. I mean, you mean well, you think you're right. But anyway, he believed he should appoint the church officials. This way, of course, he'd have control. The Pope said, no, the church should appoint its own officials. They clashed. The Pope got his way by putting Henry under interdict. Now, in those days, people were terrified. When a land was put under interdict, that meant there could be no marriages performed, no sacraments performed, and that meant everybody who died while the land was under interdict was eternally lost. Henry realized he could not stand that because it would turn all of his nobles and all of his people against him. He went to the Pope, and for 4 days he walked around barefoot in the snow, shivering and shaking, begging for forgiveness. The Pope finally took him in and forgave him, and Henry was restored to the church. The land was placed off of interdict, and Henry had initially lost his battle with the church. Now that wasn't the way it remained. I mean, eventually, other kings did the popes, but Henry did not. Henry lost his battle with the Pope. This is the main thing Henry's remembered for. He tried to control the church, and he lost. The next Holy Roman Emperor of any account was Frederick. Frederick I, sometimes known as Frederick Barbarossa. Frederick I, again, like the others, he tried to unite Italy and Germany. And he was the one who first took the title of Holy Roman Empire. Before that, they were called Roman Emperors or Roman Empire. But he added the word holy because he called his alliance the Holy Empire. He could not, however, get the Pope on his side. The people of northern Italy were against him also. They said, we want our freedom from Germany. And Germany was on one side, the Alps, and Italy on the other. And again, they did not necessarily like each other. They spoke different languages, had different values. Make long story short, they did not get along all that well. The German kings would come down here sometimes to help Frederick fight in Italy. And oftentimes the Italians would just whip them really badly. I mean, because the change of climate would weaken the German fighters, whereas the Italians are used to the climate. The Italians apparently had more resistance to the diseases that were in Italy than the Germans did. So a lot of German kings lost armies fighting in Italy. Make a long story short, Germany and Italy were never able to unite with each other, much less unite among themselves. Now, Frederick Philip Augustus and Richard the Lionhearted, Richard I of England, all three of these kings got together to go on a crusade. Richard had just become king about a year before, and by this time Frederick was a veteran king and Philip Augustus was a fairly young king. They all three went on a crusade, and everybody thought, the Muslim world is going to get it now. Well, what happened? Frederick was drowned trying to cross the river with heavy armor on. I mean, it seemed like he should have known better. Maybe he slipped. But anyway, he was drowned. When he was drowned, his entire army, instead of staying together, his entire army went home. Philip Augustus turned around and went back home. Fury on the whole idea, and that left Richard to face the Muslims alone, with only the English army, because when Philip went home, so did most of his army. Richard could not defeat Islam, with the result that Richard finally gave up and started back home. Frederick II. Now, he was not the son of Frederick I. Again, because the Holy Roman Emperors were never picked that way. He has been called a brilliant failure. Frederick II was undoubtedly intelligent. And a lot of times an intelligent person can think, hey, I'm better than everybody else, so he decides I can act independently of everybody else. And I think that was part of Frederick's problem. He did as he pleased. Now, from his mother, he inherited the kingdom of Sicily. And because this was at this time the most stable, one of the more stable kingdoms in Europe, that got him elected Holy Roman Emperor. So since he has had a lot of Italian roots, unlike the others who had been German, he had Italian roots, Sicilian perhaps, and he tried to govern Italy from Sicily and govern Germany both. Again, all these emperors in turn failed in their attempts to do this. The northern kingdoms of Italy, Genoa, Venice, they opposed him. Germany imposed him. The Germans didn't like him because he was living in Italy. The Italians didn't like him because he was He seemed so pro-German. So he was not able to exert any power in either Italy or Germany. And Italy and Germany were destined to not unite themselves until the year 1870. Far, far in the future, far away from the Middle Ages. The church often interfered with him, and the church opposed him also. But there's a saying that a lot of times you are your own worst enemy. Frederick II destroyed himself one day when he got together an army to fight against the Pope and his enemies. And on a certain given day, he decided the weather is nice, so he called his top nobles together, his top army officers. I mean, the top army officers were the nobles. Said, hey, let's us go on a hunting trip. So he and the top nobles went into the woods on a hunting trip. And as they got back, they started to smell smoke, and the smell of smoke became stronger. When they got to their camp, they found that the enemy invaded their camp while he and his top officers were gone. They destroyed every one of his soldiers and burned all, what they hadn't taken, they burned. And he never recovered. And even his biggest admirers have got to condemn him for this act, that he should never have gone on a hunting trip when he did not know where the enemy was, except he knew they were probably somewhere nearby. I think the enemy might have gotten wind that, hey, he and his top officers were gone. So anyway, he was that type of man. He would do just what he pleased, anytime he pleased, and it eventually caught up with him. Now, Frederick, I mean, I always bring this up. He's remember something else he did. He wanted to see what language people would speak if they were never talked to. So he got together 50 orphan babies and gave their nurses strict orders, don't ever talk to these babies. All the babies died. This experiment is known to have been tried several times throughout history. And the result is always the same. I mean, you might think, well, didn't I say that some babies been reared up by wolves? Yes, but the wolves at least try to communicate through barking or through some show of affection. And that's why I had 3 babies, so I was real careful to talk to them a lot. It's known that children will speak the language they hear. Now, my own personal take on it is that humanity is simply incapable of making up his own language. Language is a legacy that has been bequeathed to us, given to us. Not something we made. Every language on earth is very, very complex. Even a language that's spoken by the most primitive people on earth are extremely complex, with a whole lot of complex verb tenses, verb forms, and complex meanings of words. Words that oftentimes sound alike but have slight differences. I mean, every language, there's no such thing as a simple primitive language, indicating that everybody who speaks is speaking a language you learned from. I mean, the primitive people who speak a language they learned from their more advanced ancestors. Again, you can believe what you want to about the origin of language. All right, we'll move on. Slavic people. The word slave comes from the Slavs. Again, the Slavic people are first mentioned in the Roman times, and the Romans took them and used them as slaves. The Slavic people's original home appears to have been here in Mongolia, along with the Bulgars, the Magyars, the Huns, the Turks, several other people were the Slavs. They came over. Unlike the Huns, though, they did not come over to plunder. They just simply came over to settle. They joined up with their fellow Huns in Hungary. I mean, they knew they were distantly related to these Huns, and they helped form the nation of Hungary. But a bunch of them spread out and spread into Russia and into Poland and into the Balkan region, what is once was Yugoslavia and Albania and Bulgaria and Greece. A lot of the Slavs spread there. Now, on a somewhat sadder note, Adolf Hitler believed that they were inferior, even though they did have white skin, but he believed they were inferior, and therefore it was okay for his armies to go in and take everything they had, and he tried it. He invaded Russia, because Russia was primarily made up of Slavic peoples, and Hitler lost badly. Lost his entire army that he sent to Russia, and never fully recovered from his loss in Russia. Same thing happened to Napoleon 100 years before. Anyway, the Slavic peoples divided into several different ethnic groups. they all converted to some form of Christianity. Now, again, folks, that word Christian depends on what you might mean by Christian. I want to reiterate, they were not Southern Baptists, if that's what you think I'm talking about. And in fact, they were not even Protestant by any definition of the word Protestant. But nevertheless, they were Christian, at least in that they made a profession of believing. Now, some of them became, Europe had divided itself this time into two branches of Christianity. On the one hand, there was the Orthodox, and on the other hand, there was the Roman. The Orthodox Christians, Orthodoxy took over in places like Turkey, Greece, the Balkan region here, and Russia. This part of the world tended to be more Orthodox, while Poland and Czechoslovakia and Austria, these places became Roman Catholic. What is the difference? We'll talk more about it later, but one of the differences is the Orthodox do not accept the authority of the Pope. The Roman Catholics do, and the Orthodox at least allow some of their clergy to marry. The Romans do not, but there are some differences and a lot of similarities. Anyway, the church is split with some of them becoming Orthodox and some of them becoming Roman Catholic. Now, a group of Eastern Slavic people came across the Vikings who were coming down from Scandinavia, and they were led by a people called the Rus, from where we get the name Russia. Who were the Rus? They were Northmen who mixed in with Slavic peoples. I mean, actually the Slavic peoples, you might say, welcomed with open arms. And from there we get that name Russia, which takes us up to the Russians next. The original Russian rulers settled in Kiev. Kiev is still one of Russia's biggest cities, but it's no longer the capital. But originally the capital of Russia was in Kiev, somewhere to the west of Moscow. The most significant of the Russian rulers was Vladimir. All right, I'm going to elaborate on Vladimir a little bit. Vladimir married the last Byzantine emperor's daughter. You notice that and when the Byzantine Empire fell, Vladimir said, okay, I am now the Tsar. I mean, I'm now Caesar. Because and he said, there have been two Romes. Two Romes have fallen. I'm the third Rome. The two Romes that fallen, of course, have been Rome itself and then Constantinople. Rome number one was, Rome. Rome number two was Constantinople. Rome number three was Kiev, or Russia. And he called himself Tsar. Today that name is generally spelled T-S-A-R. From his time until 1917, all the Russian rulers in turn were called Tsar, which is a Russian word for Caesar. They called themselves Caesar, claiming that they were successors, not descendants, successors of the original Caesars. Then Vladimir realized that his pagan beliefs, that he could no longer continue to worship Thor and Odin because his people were changing religions away from the old paganism, so he looked into four religions that were common at the time. Those four religions were Islam, Judaism, Roman Catholicism, and Orthodox Catholicism. All right, first of all, he rejected Judaism on the ground that he said any God who wasn't strong enough to keep his people in their homeland, now that's his view, not mine, was not good enough for him. So he said, no, somehow the Jews were scattered over the face of the earth and not good enough for their homeland. I wish you could go back and visit us now and you see, the Jews are established in their homeland. But anyway, he said, any God who can't set his people in their homeland is not good enough for him. So no Judaism. Then came Roman Catholicism. But the problem with Rome to him was that the Roman Catholics were expected, even the kings, to honor and bow down and obey the Pope. He said, no, I'm going to be top ruler. I'm Tsar. I do not obey the Pope. So no Roman Catholicism for him. Then he looked into Islam. The real problem he had with Islam, and folk, everybody knows this, so I get a lot of amens on this. The real problem with Islam forbade drinking. And anyone who knows anything about Russians knows. I'm just stating facts, folks. They like to drink. Oh, no, Islam was out. Also, he liked to roll dice. Islam frowned on that also. He liked to drink and liked to roll dice. No. So then he visited, last of all, he visited an Orthodox church, and he said it was like I entered a different world. There were these beautiful stained glass windows, and anyone who knows your daughter, their churches have these stained glass, and on the stains of pictures of biblical scenes, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the flood, Jesus' picture, Jesus meeting the woman at the well and whatever, turning the water into wine, all these pictures. And he said it was like another world. And then when the choir began to sing, he said it was like heaven had opened up, and the choir just simply sounded just again like in another world. And he was just simply enthralled by it. He embraced Orthodox Christianity, and Russia was to remain Orthodox until 1917. And to this day, most Russians who profess any kind of Christianity belong to the Orthodox Church. Very important, because when World War I broke out, the reason Russia sided with Serbia was these people were Orthodox Christians also, as was Russia. And Russia felt like it had an obligation to see that Orthodox Christians were not persecuted wherever they happened to be. So Russia remained Orthodox from that day until the communists took over. Now, about to say this about Orthodoxy. I mean, I did some extensive research on it. A buddy of mine in Rocky, many years ago, converted to Orthodoxy. I said, well, in my examination of the problem I have with it is everywhere where they have been, if the Muslims haven't taken over the communists have, well, he justified, I mean, basically, they were all in this region of the world here. And everywhere where they've been, the Muslims have taken over, and where the Muslims have not taken over, the communists have. This is a fact. He said, well, he said, keep in mind, they were geographically closer to these movements than Rome was. Well, at this point, I did a lot of speculating. Why were they not able to keep the communists out? Why were they not able to keep the Muslims out? I'll get into that a little bit later, but I'll leave that topic for now. And if any of you who's interested can think about it and do research on it. All right, now, I mentioned already Kiev. Kiev was the original capital of Russia. However, the Mongolians came in, not led by Genghis Khan, but they came in right about the time Genghis Khan was moving, and they conquered Russia, and they held it for 200 years. Very important. It said, yes. Who? All right. I have heard it pronounced Kiev. Now, I used to look at it and pronounce it. If you know any better, well, you're welcome to say so. If you're from that part of the world, I've heard it. I've researched it. In my research, I've learned. I mean, I first pronounced it Kiev, like you. Then, I mean, that's the way it's spelled. But then I looked it up, and they pronounce it Kiev. At least the authorities operating it have. Do you know any difference? I mean, I know how it's spelled. I know how it's spelled. And I used to, as a kid, I always pronounced it, but then I learned it a little better. So anyway, the Mongolians held it, and it's been said if you scratch a Russian today, underneath that Russian skin, you're going to find a Mongolian. Because they still have a lot of Mongolian. In fact, Russia had a problem. Did they face to the east? In other words, China and Russia, or did they face to the west? And to this day, they still can't make up their mind whether east or west, but they have leanings both ways. After all, they're kind of here in the middle, with the west on one side influencing the east on the other side, kind of in the middle. Anyway, eventually, Moscow became the capital, and here's how. They had the good fortune. They were called Muscovy at first. Now we call them Moscow. The Dukes of Moscow had the good fortune of having a 200-year period with only 5 rulers. Every one of these 5 rulers lived to be old men, and as they got older, they turned their power over to a very mature middle-aged son. And when they died, a middle-aged son took over, and he would live to be an old man. They averaged 40 years apiece. He would have been old. Keep in mind, I say they averaged 40 years. They didn't get the throne until they're in the middle age. And they would rule till about their 80s, and then they'd pass on. Well, this meant that Moscow was ruled by some wise old men who were able to build it up, and eventually they even figured out a way to drive the Mongolians out, and it became the capital. Now, while I'm on the subject of age, the United States Constitution has a clause in it that the president and vice president must be at least 35 years old. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of you, most of you look like to me like you're well under 35. Enjoy it now. You're going to get there soon enough, sooner than you realize. But it's one clause we have in the Constitution that's never been questioned, never been. I mean, most of us simply believe that a ruler should be somewhat seasoned and mature. Now, because it is known, I can think of Sweden. Sweden had a great empire, but one day they had a ruler who got stomach cancer, Charles XI by name. He died in his early 40s and turned the throne over to an immature rat named Charles XII. And Charles XII destroyed the empire. Had he been 30 years older, he might have been wiser. But he was young and a little bit foolish. And he destroyed. This has happened many a time throughout history. So our founding fathers who wrote the United States Constitution said the president and vice president must be at least 35. Just throw that in for comparison's sake. Anyway, all right, so much for that for the time being. Russia seemed more tied to the east and the west, and also they spent a lot of their time lagging behind and catching up. But today, folk, during most of my lifetime, Russia's been behind, but guess what? Today, they're leading the coalition that the United States should be leading against the enemies of civilization. And they're making a lot of splash in the Middle East because they seem more concerned about it than we are. Don't know what's going to happen, folk, but it might not be good for the United States. All right, we're going to move on. Commercial Revolution, Religious Revival. All right. Again, you've been at the part of jumping to modern times a little bit here. The period of time I'm talking about is known as the High Middle Ages. It was a time of prosperity. It was a time of relative peace. Farms really produced. Europeans became creative and inventive. This did not last long. The period of time between the year 1000 and 1300, during this 300-year period, that is, Europe's population doubled. At 1300, Europe's population reached a high that it was not to reach again until 1750. Europe was to go through 450 years of decline. Well, they started to increase their population by the year 1600, but in the late 1600s, their population dropped again. You all know what I'm thinking. What caused the drop in both cases? The climate cooled. But the High Middle Ages, folk, we believe were as hot as a firecracker. During the High Middle Ages, Greenland was a land of grassland. A grassland where they could graze their animals just like they did here in Norway. Greenland was green. Grapes from their description, though, these grapes will no longer grow any farther north than New Jersey, but they were growing these grapes in Newfoundland. In other words, basically the climate change, the big freeze that went on beginning in the year 1300 is still going on. So if you think the climate's warming, no, we're still in the Ice Age, and we're just now somewhat coming out of the Ice Age. But in the High Middle Ages, they were as hot as a firecracker, and life was never, ever better. All right, at the bottom of the totem pole had been the serfs. Folk, the only difference between the serf and the slave, the serfs were like saying they were owned, but they could not be sold. Europeans bragged on it, oh, we outlawed slavery late when Christianity took over. Well, to some extent they did. I mean, the serf was owned by his lord, like property, and he was looking at property, but the lord could not sell it. That was the difference. So otherwise, serfs were for all practical purposes slaves, but more and more serfs, like the old slaves in Roman time, were able to buy the freedom. Europeans began to move from farm to town. People living in cities, their numbers rose. Trade began to increase. Money began to come into circulation. And again, we don't quite know where it all came from, but money started circulating more. Iron came into widespread use. Europeans were not yet using steel, but They were using iron for axes, hoes, saws, swords, armor. Now, scythe. This morning, nobody in my class knew what a scythe was. Anybody have any idea what a scythe is? It's a long sickle. All right, one or two. It's a long, long sickle. It's kind of back-breaking, back-twisting. But they used to cut hay with a scythe before the reaper was invented. And I can do twice to 3 times as much work as a sickle can, a small sickle. But it's a cutting tool to cut hay or to cut grass that is overgrown. Now, they developed a new kind of plow called a Karuka. Now, folk, a lot of you who are using foreign words in your writing do not italicize them, and I'm docking points for that. But the Karuka, again, it's a foreign word, is a plow. It was a plow that you could hitch up to 20 horses to, so it was a very... Now, at first, the people of the Middle Ages used oxen. The ox is very, very strong, but anyway, the horse was faster. Now, because 20 horses takes a long time to get them all turned around, European farmers learned how to farm in long, long strips. Then they turn the plow around or turn the horse around and farm in. And if you could have gone overhead, you might have thought they were like strips of bacon, but they would farm in long, long strips. And to get their 20 horses, each man would loan his neighbor's horse. Or today we'll plow Mr. Jones's field. Today we'll plow Mr. Smith's field. And they'd all loan each other horses. They got enough horses together to make for plowing. And they got to where they were cooperating. Now, this spirit of cooperation did not last indefinitely. They also learn how to practice 2 and 3 field farming. Let's say this is field 1, field 2, and field 3. Field 3. Well, the first year they would not plow field 3, and they'd plow wheat maybe here, and barley here. The next year they would plow wheat over here, and barley here, and nothing here. And then finally the third year they'd plow with, let's see, wheat here, barley here, and nothing here. Now, it was 3 crop rotation. It was not only letting land lie fallow, but also rotating your crops, because they didn't know that different crops take different minerals from the soil. But another thing, by letting your land lie fallow, the land will grow up in weeds, and when the weeds die in the wintertime, they put nutrients back into the soil. So a lot of nutrients get put back in the soil by simply letting the land not lie fallow. Now, of course, today we have really fancy fertilizers that can do this for now. I'm saying this, does anybody know what I'm talking about? Farming. Anybody have any ancestors or grandparents, who were farmers? Okay, some of you, yeah. My mother's father was a farmer, and some of my aunts and uncles took it up for a while. They're all retired by now. Most of them are deceased, unfortunately, but they're all retired by now. But a lot of my relatives were farmers. And yeah, I keep a postage stamp garden in my place where I raise blackberries, strawberries, blueberries, tomatoes, and grapes, a few little things like that. Anyway, leaving that, but yeah, I have a little small farm. I mean, really, really, really tiny, understand, postage stamp size. Be amazed how much postage stamp gardens can produce, though. The sweet potato, yeah, amazing, little bitty. Yeah, about the size of from here to the corner, yeah. Amazing how much they can produce. All right, anyway. Oh yeah, a couple of inventions. The Europeans, now I've already mentioned how the Chinese developed the shoulder harness for horses. Instead of making the animal pull by its neck, they developed a shoulder harness where the horse could pull a lot stronger of a load because he was pulling from his shoulder rather than from his neck. And they also began to build windmills, and they would grow wheat, and then to grind the wheat into flour, they would, instead of just doing by hand, they found a windmill was a great device to use. And then sometimes they would dam up water and use water wheels to turn the grindstones. Now the problem with windmills is the wind does not always blow. Now we have in this country, the windmill is making a comeback, where the people are trying to get big windmills to produce electricity, and they work when the wind is blowing. And much too often the wind does not blow and no electricity is produced. Same way with these solar panels. They work when the sun is shining, and guess what they do when the sun is not shining. And water wheels, same way. The water sometimes freezes up in the wintertime. And also in drought, the water dries up. But nevertheless, it was a beginning. They began to use the iron horseshoe and came into widespread use. So in short, they were able to produce a whole lot more food. They began to drain swamps. Things were getting really, really better for Europeans at one time. Diet was based largely on bread, and a lot of times what they do is they put the bread down on the dish, and that was the staple, and then put other things like vegetables and meat on top of the bread, and that was their meal, bread mostly, and with a little bit of other stuff added to it. Cities began growing, population was growing, people were getting a bit wealthier, things were prospering. However, the water became very polluted, and Europeans had to drink from wells. Unfortunately, though, a lot of Europeans turned to drinking ale instead of drinking water only, because the water was so polluted. Folks, this has made news just within the last week or so. The Iranian leader wanted to visit France, and the French insisted that we allow the alcoholic drinks, and the Iranian leader said, no, you don't, and they couldn't even meet because they couldn't agree on whether or not alcohol. Did you ever hear about this? I mean, this actually went on just a week ago. I guess most of them missed it, but yeah, the Iranian president was going to France to have a meal with the French president. They just could not agree on serving alcohol. But a lot of the Europeans who died as a result of accidents that were brought on when they took risks that they would not have taken if they had not been under the influence. In fact, I had several students do papers on alcohol consumption. It's known that about almost every European male consumed alcoholic beverages during the Middle Ages. And when they came to America, most of them did also, and many of them became alcoholic. But the consumption of alcohol curtailed when factories came up and the factory owners had bought this expensive machinery, and they realized that drunk people could not operate it. And they said to their workers, you have to curb your appetite for alcohol because simply I cannot hire you if you are going to drink. And this did a lot to convince people. And of course, in today's world with the automobile, our government still does not allow drinking and driving. And I can tell you, still got a lofty employee who did that and got 180 days in the slammer, and he served every day of it. They fired him, but the union got him back on. But he lost a lot of his seniority. I mean, it was a justifiable sentence. I mean, but anyway, leaving that. Now, you had crafts. The craftsmen began to specialize. Some became blacksmiths, some became tanners, and some became cobblers or other shoemakers. These craftsmen began to form guilds. The guild was the forerunner of the trade union. These people would claim that they were forming guilds in order to guarantee the customer got a good quality product. In other words, basically, if you bought a shoe that was made by a member of a guild, you were guaranteed this was the best shoe that money could buy. The real reason, though, was they didn't want competition. They felt like competition destroyed them. Or if the competition, if you didn't put out a quality product to offend your customers, you'd go out of business. But they had three classes of people, and this is still going on in some factory: the apprentice, the journeyman, and finally the master. The master was then qualified. The apprentice often began as an unpaid helper at the age of maybe 10. And the journeyman might begin at the age of 17. And then the master, whenever he felt like he was good enough to step out on his own, he would break away from being a journeyman and set up his own business, and he was expected to join a guild. If you didn't join a guild, you could expect to have your work sabotaged or in other ways be picked on. Now, to sell the products, Europe began to set up fairs, and the fair is still going on, but they would get together in these big fairs and get all the people from miles around to come to them. And the buyers and sellers would meet, and the sellers would convince the buyers that they were selling, hey, we can sell this to you cheaper here because we expect to sell more, and you can buy it cheaper than you can back home. So the fairs were set up. Unfortunately, a lot of vices went on in the fairs too, and it was said that when the fair was over, the confessional was a very busy place as people went to the confessionals for various reasons. All right. Now, back to religion, Christianity. The Dominicans, founded by St. Dominic, were a big part. Dominicans were a big part of the life of Europeans. The Dominicans would tend to the sick, among other things. Good deeds. They would sometimes grow small gardens. They would help the poor. And they would copy ancient manuscripts, all of which you could commend them for. But also, they were involved in what's called holy office. And folks, this is a black mark in European history. Another name, holy office, was a polite way of saying inquisition. The Inquisition was where they would find heretics and oftentimes burn them alive or torture them in other ways to try to get them to recant their heresy. The word heretic means a person who disagrees with the church. Heresy is no longer a crime in this country. Now, some churches, will kick you out if your doctrine is too different from the doctrine of the church. Yes, it still happens, but each church can define its own set of beliefs. But at one time, heretics were executed. And the numbers of heretics believed to be executed run into the millions over periods of centuries. In other words, it was not just a small thing. Now, for many generations, the Catholic popes never apologized, but I want to say this. Pope John Paul II, during his pontificate, issued what amounts to an apology for the Inquisition. So, I also want to say this, folks. Between that period and now, Western Europe went through a time called the Reformation. You don't find a period called the Reformation among the Islamic peoples, but you do among Western Europeans. Both the Reformation involved both Protestant and Catholic. So reform, one of the things that made Europe what it was it was capable of reforming itself. Anyway, the Dominicans their job was to root out heretics and see that everybody was a member of the church. Pope Gregory VII, now this is not Gregory the Great. He was the Pope who opposed Henry IV. He insisted that the church must appoint its own officials. And again, I would have to say he was right, but even though yes.
Is Gregory VII?
Yeah, Gregory VII. I've got V2I up there. Yeah, Gregory VII. Yeah, that's a V2I. Yeah, Pope Gregory VII. He was the one who clashed with Henry IV. Now, eventually, they reached an agreement called the Concordant. All right, this is not going to look the way it's spelled, folks. If any of you know anything at all about German, that's the Concordat of Worms. That word is pronounced Worms. Basically, where they said that the church appoints its own officials and the secular state appoints its officials. That was eventually reached, where the church appointed its officials. At first, the lords had to approve, the nobility had to approve the choice, but then it got to where the nobility no longer had to approve the choice. The church got the right to appoint its own officials without the state. Again, I think this is one of the things, folks, that wound up making Europe more advanced. It eventually separated church from state, more so than you find in other places in the world. The church became its own independent body, the state became its independent body, and the two became separate. And Anyway, now, the greatest pope, the most powerful pope who ever lived, was Pope Innocent III. Innocent III, among other things, he ordered 2 crusades. Well, they both failed. But he believed that the Pope should be supreme over everyone, and all the kings of Europe were subject to him. Well, King Philip Augustus of France wanted to divorce his wife one day and marry another woman. Pope Innocent said, this marriage is illegal. This divorce is illegal. I did not sanction it. Take your wife back. And Philip Augustus took his wife back. Now, folk, again, my own take on that is Innocent should have told the king that what he was doing was immoral, but he should not have had the authority to tell him he had to take his wife back. If he should have served as a conscience, a guiding conscience, but not in that. But anyway, he told the king, Philip Augustus, take his wife back, and the king did. When King John of England, one of Europe's most powerful kings, King John decided he wanted to appoint the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope said, no, I'm going to appoint him. And John backed down. All the kings of Europe backed down before him because he was so powerful. He would use the interdict to get his way. Under him and the popes who followed him, there were more dissenters killed than under all the rest of European history combined, as far as killed by the church, that is. He defined the sacraments, and now I know about, but I'm going to close with this. The subject of indulgences. Now, folk, I can never talk about indulgences without blushing. Maybe in a minute you'll know why. Essentially, an indulgency was where you go to a priest and pay for forgiveness for a sin. Now, supposing you saw you had an opportunity to commit some sinful act, you'd go to the priest and tell the priest what sin you wanted to commit, and then you and the priest would haggle over a price, and the bigger the sin, the more money you were expected to pay. And after you had agreed on a fee, and also the priest, the richer you were, the more money he'd expect you to pay also. After you'd agreed on a fee, you'd pay the priest a fee, and the priest would write you out a bill of indulgency. And both you and the priest knew that you were going to go out and at least try to commit the sin you had just purchased forgiveness for. Now, if you think there's something wrong with the theology, everybody today does. And I must state, folks, the Catholic Church no longer sells indulgences. The fact they once did is somewhat an embarrassment to them. But the money they raised from the sale of indulgences built St. Peter's, which is still standing and still used to this day. Now, moving ahead just a little bit, the sale of indulgences bumped smack dab head on into some man one day, and the sale of indulgences came out second best. Anybody know what man I'm talking about? Some man in Europe stopped the sale of indulgences. His name is Martin Luther. Excellent. A few of you, a couple people in the other class do, maybe more of you do. Martin Luther. Yeah, I ran into Martin Luther one day, bumped head on, and you might say, Martin Luther told the world, hey, all of you are out of step, now I'm the only one of you who's in step. How did Martin Luther get away with it? Because a lot of Europeans were thinking the same thing he was, including some of the electors in Germany, and the most powerful elector in Germany, named Frederick the Wise, sheltered and protected Luther. And Luther wound up dying in his bed, a natural death, without being killed like so many other of them were. He said what the world was ready to hear, when the world was ready to hear it, when things had gotten so bad. Indulgences were originally sold to try to help get loved ones out of purgatory, and that's why I have purgatory. Purgatory is a place that Catholics believe you go when you, if you haven't been good enough for heaven yet and not bad enough for hell, you go to an intermediate place where eventually you get punished enough for your sins and then you're allowed into heaven. It's called purgatory, a place where you're purged from your sins. Protestants generally do not believe there is a purgatory. Catholics do, but indulgences are where you could free your loved ones from purgatory. All right, with that, no, I'm out of time. Everybody have a good weekend. Next time we'll talk about universities, which Europe had, nobody else did. And it's believed that universities did a lot to make Europe more knowledgeable. And then came along some great teachers and great artists. We'll talk more about that come Monday. I'll see you then.